I want to pick up on something that you mentioned during your opening chat about this contempt for democracy that tends to happen across Europe, that we're seeing echoed now after a couple of votes haven't gone necessarily the way that people would have wanted them to. How do we move forward from that?
Well, I think the Europeans have a big problem here, because the Europeans really want democracy to produce the results that they want it to produce. And whenever a referendum or an election occurs which doesn't produce the right result as far as they're concerned, they reject it. In fact, they actually demonstrate a contempt for genuine democracy. They only pretend to be democratic. And I think this is a part of the French and Spanish and Italian and Dutch culture. It's something that's been encouraged by the European Union. The English are almost the only people in Europe who, in my view, are genuinely attached to democracy.
And something else that you mentioned as well was the very, very important role that the media played in the run-up to any of these elections. And let's take Brexit as an example. What do you think the role was that the media had to play, both broadcast and in print?
Well, the print media, I think, actually was fairly evenly balanced because, of course, we have a large number of newspapers in Britain, and each person selects a newspaper which conforms with his own prejudice. So he reads things that he wants to read, and that's been the way, of course, for the last several hundred years. Nothing new about that. But television news has changed, in my view anyway. Television news 30, 40, 50 years ago was fairly neutral and was respected for its impartiality by the vast majority of the population. BBC had a very high status in the rest of the world and in Britain. But what's happened, I think, in this last 20 or 30 years is that the BBC and the other television media in Britain has become rather one-sided, rather left-of-centre-ish, rather pro-European, that the CNN, as it were, of America, and has consequently produced in our view, somewhat biased reportage of the events of the Brexit.
I was going to ask you as well about how the different people that have come into power or have won elections, because or votes, let's call them votes rather than elections, are perceived as outsiders, and there is this distinct identification of them as non-establishment people. How do you think that plays into people's minds when they go and cast a ballot?
Well, they're not really outsiders. I would say that Nigel Farage was the only genuine outsider in any of these circumstances, any of these referenda or polls, because he came from finance, and he had never had any relationship with politics before he became leader of UKIP. On the other hand, people like Macron, he's not a member of one of the two main parties, but he's had a long association with French politics and was very far from being a complete outsider, therefore. And the same is to some degree true of Trump in America, because although he hadn't had any elected responsibilities in the past, he rubbed shoulders with politicians a great deal in his business days, giving or making contributions to their political funds. He was friends with a lot of politicians, friends with the Clintons, for instance.
What can we learn from the last 19 months of elections and ballots that haven't necessarily turned out the way people expected them to?
I think the obvious answer is that in many countries, people are angry, people are frustrated, people feel that their governments aren't looking after the interests of the people who matter, the people, in fact, who provide the money, who do the work. They're looking after the interests of themselves, on the one hand, these politicians looking after their own interests, and looking after the interests of others in society, possibly immigrants, possibly special interests, possibly bankers. In fact, I would say the bankers are the ones who come highest up the hate list, because these were the people who created the financial crisis 10 years or so ago, and the people who should have been punished for it, but were instead rewarded. It was as if, in fact, somebody had mugged a victim, and then the police come along and take even more money from the victim to give it to the mugger. We helped out, we bailed out, we protected the bankers. The bankers should be in prison, they're actually living in luxury. This is deemed by many people in society to be extraordinarily unfair.